Welcome to this session on recalibrating international relations. Welcome to our speakers as well from all over the world. We have a little UN here at the table. We're going to start with a short exercise. I'm going to ask each one of the speakers to write on this piece of paper, on each one. Do you have all the pen? To write the first word that comes to your mind when you think about international relations. Don't show to your sides. Ready? Okay, we can turn them at the same time. 1, 2, 3. I think the camera is going to show it from above. I'll try to read the handwriting. What do we have over here? Trust, interdependency, inclusiveness, and power. So let's expand a little bit on that, each one around 1 minute. Why don't we start over here? Trust, how come?
Well, thank you very much. I think we have entered an era in international relations when there is, in fact, utter lack of trust. So for me, I think this is the fundamental basis for forging international relations. And whenever there has been trust at the international level, we have seen better relations. The lack of it has led to conflict and friction. And we have seen how, for instance, the lack of trust that continued even in the aftermath of the First World War led to, for instance, a failure of the Treaty of Versailles or the short-lived League of Nations. The League of Nations didn't have the support of the United States of America. And in the 1930s, as mistrust developed, you found a very large number of countries leaving the League of Nations. Japan left, Germany left, Italy left, and finally the Soviet Union left in 1939. It led to a situation where the global community descended into the Second World War. So in order to avoid wars, one of the fundamental requirements is trust. But with trust comes the all-important aspect of transparency and the ability to read not just capabilities, but also intentions.
Perfect. Thank you. Let's talk about interdependency. We will come back to all of this, so don't worry, you will have more time to expand on it. Julia, please.
Thank you. I think the reason why I landed here was because in the past couple of years, the global community has been trying to redefine the concept of sovereignty and where to draw lines, whether it's economically, technologically, militarily speaking. Quite frankly, I've always been the economist in the room as an alumna of the US government to say, sorry, you can't do that because we have relationships with X, Y, Z and different reasons. So I think that, for me, there's a bit of a paradigm in the so-called security community versus those working in business or in technological or economic spheres, which will say, actually, the fundamental core value here is not how we define ourselves against the other, but what the dynamics of our relations with that entity are. So just to flip that a little bit on the head.
Thank you. Please. Yours was? Remind us?
Inclusiveness, right? Inclusiveness. I have 2 reasons behind. One is I think that this value is one of the most critical or fundamental ingredients or necessary ingredients of international relationship for facilitating the mutual understanding, for paving the way for a possible cooperation, and also could serve as a catalyst for equality, whether within or beyond a national territory. And I think it's also one of the basic requirements for the sustainable development goal. But having said that, I think another reason is inclusiveness is also in a short supply nowadays. And we have seen those voices about decoupling, the voices for exclusion, the voices for those ideology-based blocks. I think that all those things actually is just an opposite of the inclusiveness.
Thank you. And Fonte, you had power, and also really big on the paper. So tell us, what are your thoughts?
Well, I hear everything that has been said so far, but power remains one of the central factors that determines relations between state and the driver within alliance formation as well. And I think what we are seeing, in fact, is whether you're looking at hard power, smart power, or soft power, the configuration of power itself is changing in international relations. The currency of hard power as a means to actually extend influence is diminishing, and that has implications for the kinds of actors which actually play on the international scene, and it also has implications for the margins for maneuver of the different actors within the international context. And I think it's extremely difficult to actually look at geopolitics without trying to understand the power dynamics and the material content behind each country and each actor's power. And here, I would disaggregate between countries, multinational companies, multilateral organizations, but also civil society networks globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So it's interesting that some of the values you mentioned, you actually mentioned them because they are lacking, so that we don't have, you say, there's not enough trust at the moment, maybe inclusiveness was also lacking. There might be too much interdependency, if I understood it correctly, to a certain extent. And then, of course, there's the issue of power. We're going to be going back to that, of course, during the conversation. I want to talk first a little bit about the title of the session, which says Recalibrating International Relations. So, Fonte, for example, I want to ask you, do you think they were calibrated in the first place? And if they were they calibrated for everyone equally?
Well, that is a tricky question, right? Because I'll go with yes and no. The international context that emerged post-1945 was basically calibrated for the world at that point in time. Of course, it was a victor's system. It established the United Nations system as well as a system of global governance, which has actually evolved quite a bit since then. Today, there is clearly the necessity, based on a number of factors, to actually recalibrate the system. The first is understanding the nature of the challenges which confront our common...
But was it calibrated for everyone?
I would say no, not for everyone, absolutely not.
For who was it calibrated and for whom not?
As mentioned before, it was a victor's configuration, which did not reflect, for example, in 1945, you've got to ask yourself the question of how many African countries were independent. Since then, Africa actually has the biggest voting bloc within the United Nations General Assembly due to the independence of African states. So taking that into consideration, there clearly is a need for recalibration if you use that as a single factor.
Okay. I want to take that about the voting bloc and the issue of the AU, the African Union, representing around 55 countries, if I'm correct. You talked about inclusiveness. The African Union might join the G20. Would it make it more inclusive if the African Union joins the G20? Or actually, is it making it the whole policy space even more exclusive, given that other regions wouldn't be represented?
Well, this is always a half empty, half full question. You know, it's quite tricky. But I think that as the important developing country, the important continent for a large number of developing countries, African Union should have its more voices in those multilateral institutions, including G20, as you said, including United Nations. I know that nowadays we have South Africa already been there, but I think that maybe that's not enough. So I'm quite open. I think that even Chinese government would be supportive to the AU's as an institutional member into G20, as I suppose that if we read their policy line very carefully.
Thank you. Julia, I want to ask you about a question of interest versus value. Do you think is that the relationship, or is it actually a false dilemma there? In foreign relations, sorry.
I think countries do act on values quite frequently. Certainly, in certain overseas engagements, reflect often a founding mythos of a country. On the other hand, I don't think you can fully say that disconnect the two. There are always interests behind whatever a country does, right? There's always, I mean, I think that there is an underlying value of interests and how to define the power dynamic between different countries in order to defend specific equities in a specific region. But then also on the value layer often sort of lies on top of that, right? So I don't think that that countries will ever say that they do something just in the act of defending their own interests, right? There's always a value set that is reflected within that. But that sometimes I'll be the first to admit it here that that defending values is often a palliative over some sort of realpolitik and some very core things that you don't like to call directly by their name.
And is a group like G20, for example, based on values, on interest, on both? Does it leave out others that are not like-minded?
So I think the G20 presidency of India is quite unique because it's people-centric, both within the country, that means 1.4 billion people for the first time in the history of any G20 presidency. The entire population of a large country like India has been involved. And it is also a G20 presidency in which the abiding principle is leave no one behind, literally. And that is also the sentiment expressed in the UNGA resolution 75/1 of 21st September 2020, marking the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, leave no one behind. That comes from our ancient wisdom, our civilizational heritage of the world is one family, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. I'm not suggesting here that there are no similar sentiments in other civilizations. I know for a fact that large countries like India and China may in fact share in terms of their civilizational outlook and a concept of inclusivity. Professor Chan has mentioned inclusiveness. I know even in Chinese there is the saying, 四海之内皆兄弟也, or 四海为家, that the world is one family. So here we are speaking of our ancient Asian heritage. The world would be a much better place if large countries and populations like India and China were to build a new paradigm based on equality and inclusiveness in a multipolar world. So these are
similar values there, I see. And are they so much more different from other regions of the world, or do you think that you can work with that with others?
For me, we have entered a very complex period in our history. 77 years after the United Nations was set up, it really has failed to meet the needs of the time. The power quotients along every axis have changed in terms of the redistribution of military power, economic power, and some might say even soft power and smart power, or hard power. In any case, is a reflection of military power. And so we have now a set of what I call the 6 T's that bedevils every geography across the world. The first is trade and the kind of contestation that goes with trade, but it is something that's hard to control. Trade is fungible. It's not governments that run trade, which is why we see China's trade with India or with the United States or with Japan shooting up, even at a time of tensions, for instance. Then there is the T of technology, where it's much more possible for governments to interfere through sanctions and export controls. The third T is that of territorial disputes. Whether in Asia or in Europe, you see that it is fracturing the consensus. The fourth T is that of terrorism. which has now become a feature in every part of the world, and without peace and security, there's no development. The fifth T is that of tenets.
Of?
Tenets, as in narratives. Whose narrative is superior? Is it the liberal, open democratic system, or is it the quasi-liberal or state-led capitalism, democracies versus autocracies? And it has descended into that. And the last one is the T of trust, which I began with. So this is something that is now present in all geographies. And unless we address these 6 Ts, along with a very rich dose of transparency, we're not going to get anywhere.
So we have a 7th T there.
Yes, today I'm adding the 7th one to my own set of 6 Ts.
7, not 6. Great. Fonte, do you want to respond to any of these? Any particular keyword here from the 7 Ts that you think are essential?
Well, I mean, I think what Chinhoy has presented really as universal and cross-cutting issues actually are cross-cutting priorities, which also affect Africa, because I think the issue of trade is key with the African Continental Free Trade Area coming into operationalization. But to make that happen on the continent, technology is crucial. The issue of patents within the WTO system have to be addressed as well. So I think overall he captures issues which terrorism, for example, is an impediment to the full operationalization of the FCFTA, for example. So I think given that he covers the breadth of issues, I would not take exception to any one of them.
Okay, so you agree. I think over here you agree as well. You agree too?
I think mainly. I think one sort of two-finger that I would say about the G20 is that it's also not an institution that's written in stone. It's relatively new as a constellation of nations. And to think that it was a group that was put together in a point of financial crisis, and that the initial sort of success that bolted the G20 to be the sort of paradigm of international convenings on the global stage was the international financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Again, as we move on to see what is on our plate today, right, just to go back to about the inclusion of the African Union, say, well, what are the problems that are here right now? And maybe that constellation of countries has to change to adapt to the stakeholders that need to be at the table to resolve those. So specifically thinking about the climate crisis or
what would you suggest to do that?
I mean, I think that there could be, and there are also already our constellations where there are guests that are brought to the table, specific convenings, but I think that there should be some flexibility to have different concentric constellations of countries that meet on a more variable basis to find fundamental agreements on certain issues. It shouldn't be let's wait for the G20 meeting as if it's sort of the holy event of the year, where unless we resolve this at the G20 summit, right, then we've got to wait a year until the presidency of another country. That's what I find a little bit problematic.
Want to respond to
that? Yeah, I think that the logo here, the global solutions, and in the past 1.5 I has been here. I think that I'm deeply impressed by the fact that on one side we may differ on many of the issues, including its root cause of those challenges and risks. But on the other hand, I also quite deeply impressed or encouraged that most of those colleagues here will talk about that actually we are in the process of crossing the river at the same boat. You see, this is also the first version of Chinese translation of Deutsch, 同济, right? This is also the first Chinese version of Chinese translation of the Deutsch, means we are crossing the river with the same boat. I think such kind of a same boatness plays an important role here. And I think Ambassador Chinhoy has contributed so many T's. I would like to offer something like a CSC, something like that. C here, we need to cultivate a kind of a common sense of where are we now and beyond. Yesterday, your chancellor mentioned the multi-polarization. But I think that we should not forget a much bigger, broader context in which multipolarization nowadays is taking place. It is a hyper-connected and increasingly interdependent world. This is, I think, multipolarization is now taking place, the biggest context and background. Otherwise, I think that we will only refer to those old manual in the 18th century, 19th century, even early part of the 20th century's multipolarization. And that will give us a more bad history lessons. Refers to the S, I think that we should also work hard to explore that despite of differences, diversities, or even some ideologically quite diverge or even conflicting, but we still have some shared values. I think that yesterday and today, I'm also quite encouraged by some colleagues mention about that even those different countries with different cultural tradition, ideology, political institutions, we could work together for some shared values against those common bads and for those common goods.
What would be the shared values, for example?
Many. For instance, when Ambassador mentioned about those issues like a technology, those disruptive emerging technology, how to deal with or how to take the potential of its benefits, but at the same time, we need to harness and those negative sides. This is the shared values that we should work together. We need to work the human being as the center rather than have those technology control us. This is, I think, the shared value, right?
Julia, how do you see it?
I think that that individual sovereign, I say the word sovereign after mentioning interdependency, I think that countries don't know what they want to do or how to define their own positions vis-a-vis new and emerging technologies. And so I think it's going to be an incredible challenge to use international fora to try to create new standards at a moment when countries don't know how to position themselves. I'm not to say that those conversations shouldn't start, right? And probably the earlier the better. But I would hope that that countries would not be forced to come to a preemptive solution on how to define the values, define how certain technologies may be used, because they will be forced to position themselves vis-a-vis the other, or make false assumptions about how another country might define those lines. When, I mean, God knows, no one knows where any of this is going, governments have not had conclusive enough conversations with their private sectors. So I was in Washington 2 weeks ago, and I was going in to visit some former colleagues at the White House. I was mauled by some press who were trying to overrun a bunch of tech CEOs in the US who had been called into the White House to essentially explain themselves. Right? And so the United States clearly has no concept how it wants to handle this. I'm not going to expect my leadership to be able to come to multilateral meeting and say, okay, we have, here's the US position. That would be irresponsible.
There's also much of the world that, might be very much behind in technology. When we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, et cetera, it's happening for some, but for others it's not. So going back to the inclusiveness, if technology is, like you say, one very important value, how do we get them also into the conversation? Do you have an idea?
Well, I think the assumption that these spaces are not in the conversation might be a little problematic. Because when you talk about the fourth industrial revolution, you're also speaking about the critical raw materials that would actually drive it. And so beyond just the soft matter and the technology itself, there has to be a reflection around how technologies do not exacerbate the current global inequalities, one. So there's an inequality question. The second is inclusiveness. How do you include Africa into the global supply chains in ways that actually bring the continent into the fourth industrial revolution after having sort of extracted during the first, second, and third industrial revolutions? The third is the imperative for digital governance, because there are implications for technology for the way in which we organize our societies, the ways in which we vote for presidents and representatives, and different kinds of intrusions. And if we say, let's step back and understand everything before creating punishments, for example, for those who intrude into the ways in which we organize ourselves socially, I think we might be getting behind the curve rather than stepping ahead of the curve to provide a certain degree of organization of those processes within our societies. That's necessary, and I think it's fairly urgent.
Good. So I want to tie this a little bit together. So
could I just comment on the
yes, of course, please
industrial revolution part? I'm just tempted to reflect on this. From my point of view, the first industrial revolution, the invention of the locomotive or the steamship, in fact, was in the service of largely colonialism. The second industrial revolution also saw a very large part of the world becoming colonies in terms of the hinterland that provided resources for the industrial revolution in what we today call the global north. And the third industrial revolution was the first time when the information age set in, but also the era of large-scale, low-cost manufacturing, the shifting of the global engines of economic growth from traditional areas in North America and Europe to parts of Asia. That was a real opportunity for creating a level playing field. But as globalization has developed, a very large part of the global economy has slipped through the cracks and not benefited equally from the third industrial revolution. The most insidious one is round the corner, the one with quantum physics and artificial intelligence and big data. And this discourse is greatly complicated by the real possibility of decisions not being made by nation states, but also being driven by transnational entities, big tech, big business, where the fundamental principle is profit. It is not values. So what we need to create is a structure at the global level where big tech acts responsibly without curbing their sort of animal instincts to create innovation and new technologies. They have to be reined in a bit.
So how would we amend it? For example, the G20 now led by India this year. How would it amend it such a thing? Because you said our sort of mission is to leave no one behind, which you're saying now is increasingly difficult because of all these things. So how, in a as concrete way as possible, could nation states avoid this?
I would believe that to some extent, technologies have to be made profit agnostic, and that we must learn to share technologies. And this is going to be relevant to the discourse, particularly with regard to climate action. For if we keep speaking about mitigation without heeding the major challenge of adaptation in the global south, we are not going to be able to handle the great commons of the air that we commonly breathe or the water that we commonly drink. It's not going to be enough for one part of the world to be devoting resources to make the necessary transitions, and a very large part of the world not making those transitions. So it's in our interest today to de-link certain technologies from being profit-oriented to making them profit agnostic in the larger interests of mankind. If we're able to do this, and particularly without weaponizing technologies, mankind, as in humankind, I should say, will progress more rapidly.
May I come?
Oh, right, yes, please. Julia first, and then
if they're not going to be profit-driven, who drives them, right? So if it's not going to be the private sector that has the incentive to develop emerging technologies because there's a benefit on the other side, the only alternative to speak of is that they're state-run, no? If they're going to be profit-agnostic.
Well, I'd say that states have the wherewithal, and so also the private sector, to devote a certain part of the gains that they have made through certain technologies, through certain iterations of technology, to be devoted back to serve humankind. Because if we don't do this in our own interest, we will leave a very large chunk of humankind behind. When you have transnational entities making profits using your data, for instance, they also have a certain responsibility towards the people around the world. So we have to think a little deeper and in more charitable terms. I think the world today needs not just vaccines against, as I've said earlier, against the COVID-19 pandemic or any other pandemic, but a fairly liberal dose and a vaccine of morality as well. And unless if we find that, yes, we will not be able to do better.
Continue. Please, Dong Xiao, you wanted to respond.
I even do not know where I should comment Ambassador Chinoy's remarks, but I think I generally agree with his ideas that, this is a world of a multi-stakeholders involvement. This is also the idea that, this is also the main rationale why I attached greater importance to inclusiveness. Because all those stakeholders are involved. Public sector, private sectors, civil societies, markets, governments, etc. They are all involved to manage those, including those technologies breakthrough, but also need to work together to address those problems. So I think that inclusiveness is definitely very important here. And the digital economy or digital technology has its uniqueness. That is, as an ambassador has just mentioned, that it always produce kind of a winner takes all, and which will probably that it will make those biggest IT companies or technology companies to take almost all of those benefits. And if we would not have those governmental intervention, maybe it will be a problem. At the same time, I fully understand that those private sectors, we should provide incentive for private sectors to invest for those technology breakthrough movement. But I think that given the fact that those private sectors has no interest in those basic knowledge, basic science foundation. So I think that these kind of basic science foundation and education need to be invested by government. So in that case, the partnership, the public and the private partnership, it is the way for a move forward of those technology movement.
All right. So just as an info, so we have another 12 minutes. We're going to start wrapping up a little bit. I see that there's a lot of ideas still for discussion. But let's go a little bit back to the values, the interdependency. You mentioned inclusiveness. You said we're on the same boat. But it sounds to me a little bit that we're maybe in the same storm, but not necessarily on the same boat. So how do we get more trust? How do we get more inclusiveness? How do we maybe redistribute power in a way that is the recalibration that we were talking about in the beginning? How do we find an interdependency that works for everyone in a way? What are your thoughts on that?
So I'll give it a first shot. If we look at the trajectory of international relations over the past 30 years, 1991, there seemed to be quite some consensus around global mobilization to push back Iraq from Kuwait. Fast forward to post 9/11, and there's a fracturing of global alliances. And if you look even further, what you find is the diminishing currency of hard power as the means through which to advance influence. And I'm sure that if that same reading was shared, we might not have ended up with a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Because obviously, if you look at the recent history, there's not much of a positive outcome to that. The second is the growing capacity to actually use and deploy smart power, which is actually about collaboration and that redistribution that we are talking about. And looking from the African perspective, three key aspects, I think. The first is demographics. Africa is sitting at approximately 1.5 billion inhabitants now, with the potential to hit 2.1 billion by 2050, with the youngest population globally. How do we collectively think through pushing Africa towards its demographic dividend? That's a key question, and it takes, in this storm, I think it takes us all to reflect on this issue. The second here it's more of the global problem, the question of climate. How do we collectively have the, as we often talk about the responsibility of each country to act, or each actor to actually work towards climate mitigation, but how do we move towards climate mitigation collectively? And I would end on one note, the international financial system. The past panel was looking at that. How do we make that system fairer to ensure that Africa has access to the financing that it needs to be a full participant in the global economy?
Thank you. I want to take the keyword climate as a global public good. The minister mentioned India in her keynote as a key partner on climate, and I think there is a general agreement that this is something that we all need to work on and that is sort of like an important value maybe for everyone, and yet we don't manage somehow to make it happen. What do you think?
I think the approach to climate action is also different. An ancient country like India looks at climate action as not just a responsibility of governments, but also of the individual. And that is why the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Narendra Modi, has proposed at COP26 in Glasgow an idea called Lifestyle for Environment, which is essentially about creating pro-planet people. And the way to create pro-planet people is to make every individual sensitive to this task and to further what we call sustainable consumption. At whatever level of standard of living that he or she may have in any part of the world, it is possible to act responsibly. Whether you have 3 6-cylinder SUVs in your garage or whether you have none, it is possible to act in a responsible manner. So curbing what we call mindless, profligate consumption is something that we should look at. And I think that's also something that speaks to the theme of circular economy and repair, reuse, recycle kind of stuff.
But beyond the individual responsibility, at the G20 level, for example, do you all see it the same way?
I think in the G20, the task will be to build better consensus because the approach points are different. Some may favor mitigation, others may favor adaptation. We've heard that in the course of the last 2 days. So the point is there will have to be some kind of halfway house, some kind of compromise. But just because the G20 doesn't have a magic wand doesn't mean that we regard it as irrelevant. It's the only place today where without a privileged veto power or absolute great power exceptionalism, you can put some of the most important economies and countries in the world together in an inclusive manner by inviting, as India has done, special invitees, 9 of them, and actually have a dialogue where even the contestants, those that are engaged in major power contestation, may see the benefits of pulling away from the gridlocked traffic jams on the highways of multilateralism to engage in a genuine dialogue and see if something can be done. However incremental. A G20 is not to be seen as a 100-meter dash.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing process. We have to pass on responsibly the baton to the next runner in the relay.
Julia, do you agree with that? Do you think more like-minded groups like the G20 are, maybe also based on common values, are the answer to find solutions more quicker?
I think there's a bit of a game of chicken, and it has to do with economic competitiveness, that no country is willing to take a hit without another agreeing to at the same moment. And so we still haven't hit the point where we're all ready to cut the bottom line on GDP growth in the name of climate protection. I think what many, at least in the developing country perspective right now, it's about what the role of the government is actually going to be to sort of cut the competitiveness price to incentivize the private sector and incentivize the individual to take responsible decisions. And that is sort of a redefinition of, I think, what the role of the state is going to be in promoting climate change adaptation and in industrial incentives. And I think, based on the last panel, there's also, I think, an adaptation that needs to be made with international financial institutions to put many fewer conditionalities on lending. In this regard, because when I look at some of the contracts that have come out of the IMF or specifically out of the World Bank and its affiliates, right? There's an alphabet soup there that's very hard to follow, and puts so many catches and backdoors and things that I think makes it very hard for countries to take advantage of those.
Yeah, I think that I share many of their points. Climate action needs technology, needs finance, needs political will of each economies. But fundamentally speaking, if we are going to have a climate action, collective action, move forward sustainably, it is about development. We should not forget that large number of developing countries in their transition, are still in the process of modernization and try to catch up this modernization trend. They need some time to industrialize their economy. And I think that whether there's enough leadership among all those most advanced economy playing the leadership role, that's the key.
Any comments?
Well, I hope that we are not looking at industrialization as a dirty word, right? Because given advancement in technologies, we should be able to industrialize while at the same time going green. And without necessarily upsetting the political economic apple carts as well, because in fact, a lot of production systems are built on sort of rudimentary systems at the moment, and upsetting those would basically create the kind of instability in these transition processes. So there is a cost-benefit analysis to be done. And there is equally, in terms of power distribution, the necessity not to push incentives which basically are described in the global, in some parts of the African continent as using the green agenda for a new kind of colonization.
Thank you. So yeah, there is the danger of that. We have 2 minutes left. That was quick. So I want to use the 70s that we had, and maybe ask you as a last question before we leave, if you had, if there was a genie that could grant you a wish, so to say, in international relations, what is the one value that this genie could grant you so that we could tackle these problems of the 70s, etc., together?
Inclusiveness.
It stays inclusiveness. Perfect. Julia?
For me, I think it would be honesty, to be honest in international fora about what a country's capabilities actually are versus letting the rhetoric drive the agenda.
Perfect.
Well, I'd say that the most important thing for the road ahead would be the responsible exercise of power, whoever has it. Whether it's political power, whether it's economic power, this power, this word itself is very potent. And one must realize that to best appreciate power, one must also know the limits of power. So the exercise of power must come with great responsibility. Absolutely. It must be done in good faith. And one must also acknowledge the relative rise of others. So power is something that is fundamental, responsible exercise of power for the benefit of humankind.
Thank you. Last words.
In terms of global solutions, trust is key. And you cannot talk about trust without looking at history and memory and acknowledging it as a way of moving forward.
All right. Thank you so much. And with that, we will end this session 14 seconds before the clock ends. Thank you.